What is by far the big story of the day, fired FBI Director James Comey's testimony before the Senate Select Intelligence Committee. In the long history of congressional hearings, this will likely be the one where more people were following online than maybe watching live on television. For some perspective, Politico's cybersecurity reporter Eric Geller joins us this afternoon. Eric, good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
And I asked you earlier, everybody has been watching this thing. Everybody sort of has their own takeaway message. What struck you about this?
The number one thing that we learned today was that the FBI, when they were evaluating who to tell about Trump's conversations with Director Comey, they knew something about Attorney General Jeff Sessions that Director Comey couldn't share in this hearing. That's very interesting to me because we have certainly heard a lot about his conversations with the Russian ambassador, Kislyak. Is there something else that's going on here that we don't know about that would be involved in that situation?
And you have to think that that is being much more closely questioned and investigated in the closed session that's going on this afternoon.
For sure. I mean, I think what we'll see in the next couple hours is how quickly some of the people at the Washington Post and the Times and my organization Politico can get to those lawmakers and ask them, what more did Comey say that he couldn't say before?
A lot of people had very high expectations on this. Others were saying, don't be surprised if we don't learn anything specifically new in this, but what we get is sort of the cover and color, the background here. Where do you think this falls in that specter?
Well, I would say closer to the latter, to kind of the color. I mean, just the fact that the former FBI director said, I wrote down what the president told me because I couldn't be sure he wouldn't lie about it in the future. If you've been reading the New York Times, you know that that's not new. We know that, but to have him personally say it and validate those accounts is important.
There were a couple of times, too, when the director on his own, but then was also pressed on it by some of the members of the committee, talked about reporting. And I wish I could remember his exact word of it. But he was basically saying there was a story about this, and what was in that story was just flat out wrong. Well, that happens. Journalism is unfortunately an inexact science. But it was interesting to hear it from his perspective, having watched it on both sides.
For sure. He's in a very difficult position because he may want to correct the record in some of those situations. I think the story you're talking about was the New York Times saying there were extensive contacts. Yes. If you're the FBI director and you know that's not true, you're kind of burning to say that, but of course you can't. And so it's tough for him, and now he's in a position where he can hint at it a little bit. That's
the key, his perspective is everything on that, because he's now out of government, which was something that he said a number of times. It provides him some cover to speak here. But he also signed non-disclosure agreements, like everybody does, leaving a sensitive part of the government. So there are a lot of things about which he cannot talk, except in that what they call the skiff there in the basement of the Senate in closed session.
Yeah, he's going to be very careful because he certainly doesn't want to. I think one of the biggest things he has going for him is his credibility, his reputation as a straight shooter. I mean, you can agree or disagree with that, but many people who would otherwise be predisposed to completely trust the president are hedging their bets because they know the kind of person that James Comey is, and so he is not going to take any step that he knows could jeopardize that.
I think a lot of people were watching today for that very reason, taking their measure of this man.
Yeah.
How much do we believe him? How does he come across? And I think it was this is an experienced Washington hand. It was a good performance on his part, I thought.
He's being very careful. I mean, you watched him sit down, and he was just staring, ramrod straight ahead as the senators were doing their opening statements, being very careful.
Great theater.
Yes, and it was also just kind of Washington spectacle that I think we're going to see more of in the coming months, as former officials talking about the kinds of things that we could never have imagined a few years ago.
If the White House thought this was going to go away quickly after today, I think they're wrong about that.
I think so too.
Eric Geller, who is Politico's cybersecurity reporter, and good enough to join us this afternoon. Many thanks.
Thank you.